Now, one of the stories that just doesn't really get enough coverage is what is happening in the whole world of disability benefits. Think about this. There are now 3.2 million people of working age in our country claiming disability benefit. That is exactly 4 times the number that it was in 1983. And we now have 40,000 people a month going on to disability benefits. That was 20,000 a month before the pandemic. It is unaffordable, it is catastrophic, it is a huge waste of talent. And if you're depressed or have anxiety before you go on to disability benefits, and probably put on prescription drugs as well, well, you're almost certain to be even more depressed and even more anxious a few months on. I think the whole thing is a complete and utter disaster. I think it's totally unaffordable. And yes, of course, a proper, humane society wants to look after those that genuinely can't work. But I worry we're getting this wrong at every level. Now, I'm joined by senior researcher at Bright Blue think tank, Bartek Staniszewski. Bartek, you know, I know that the job of your think tank is to try and look at the benefit system and for them to be fair and reasonable. And you set out 3 big tests for how benefits should work, as I see it: adequacy, accessibility, and fairness. But do you see my point? There genuinely cannot be 4 times the number of people unable to work physically than there were 40 years ago.
In some ways, there can be, Nigel. And if you look at the trend we've seen over more recently, not since the 1980s, but in the last few years, ever since the pandemic, this is when the biggest rise has happened.
Yeah.
Ever since the pandemic, the number of those people has doubled. And this is not a coincidence. This is not because people have been lazy or because they've been claiming they're anxious or because they've been getting prescribed antidepressants with no good reason. It is because, as a country, we have become more ill. If you look at the number of people who have been dying each year over those few years, it's also the case that more people have been dying. It's also the case that more people, after the pandemic, people have not been able to access healthcare. After the pandemic, people have not been able to move. People have been forced to stay at home. So, of course, we're going to end up with a lot of ill people.
I fully accept your point that those successive lockdowns did do a huge amount of damage. I get that. And indeed, last week on the show, I covered the excess death numbers, which are still running at alarming numbers. So I get that point. But when it comes to, and I'm not trying to downplay or dismiss genuine mental illness, I'm really not. But when it comes to these conditions of depression and anxiety, this is my concern. If you tell someone they're a victim, they'll feel like a victim forever. And once people go on to these disability benefits, the evidence is they don't come off them, and they live very unproductive, very unfulfilled, and very unsatisfied lives.
There is an element of that, yes. And obviously one thing that can happen is, yes, if you tell people that they're a loser, if you tell, then they will adopt that mindset. But I will be cautious about saying that this is what is happening. I will be cautious about saying, well, because those people are on benefits, they are leading miserable lives. I suspect the likelihood is the other way around. I suspect the likelihood is they're not having the greatest time of their lives and they're receiving help from the government, as they should. You know, we are one country. We should be supporting each other. We are one nation.
Well, I'm going to add a 4th test. You've got your 3 of adequacy, accessibility and fairness. What about affordability? We can't go on like this.
It's a reasonable point to make. It's
I think it is.
At a time when the government deficit is so high, at a time government debt is so high, it is obviously very expensive, but it's also very expensive because that help is needed. It's like I said earlier, we have more people dying every year. We have more people claiming food from food banks every year. We have more people living in poverty. We have more people being homeless. We have increasingly more people that need help because the costs of living are so much higher than they were last year. I think 7 out of 10 households with a disabled person in them say they cannot even meet essential needs.
I don't say anything that you've said is wrong, Bartek, but what I do say is we have to find a way of saying to people, come on, get yourself out of this. You tell people they're victims, they're going to start thinking they are.